Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel Elliott Abrams, our co-host. Daniel, nice to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Very good, and we have a special guest today.
Yes.
He's been with us before, but he's a colleague in our efforts to promote sound economic policy and limited government. And I knew him back in Congress. We served a couple years in Congress until Ronald Reagan got him into the director of budget and OB. So he, Office of Management Budget. So he did that for a while, but then after he got out of there, he served in the House several years. But you know, when I got to know David, I think when I really realized that he was somebody that was going to vote differently is the Chrysler bailout came out. And of course, Chrysler, I think they had something to do with Michigan. So everybody voted for bailing out Chrysler except this one guy, David Stockman. He didn't vote for it. So that caught my attention.
That's a good sign.
And anyway, David voted against that, which tells you a little bit about his character. But David got started off on the right foot, or right crib, I guess we'd say, because he was born here in Texas. So he has Texas blood in him. But he's written quite a few books. He has a new book out right now that we want to have him comment on, and it's called Peak Trump. And we might get that up on the screen, and we'll talk about that. But David Stockman, our friend in Liberty. David, welcome to our program.
Happy to be with you. And Ron, since you're mentioning our days in Congress and my excellent pedigree, having been born in Texas, I would just mention that the same year that I voted against the Chrysler bailout, and I was the only one in the Michigan delegation of 19 congressmen who did, I also voted for natural gas deregulation. and so one of the old bulls from Texas, the old congressman who had been there a long time, Congressman Mahon, if you remember him,
Yeah.
he called me aside and he said, son, what's going on here? You're voting against your state. You must have been born in Texas. And I said, yes, I was. Anyway, that was a different era. And it's kind of hard to imagine that we are at the point we're at today, where we have a 22 trillion national debt. Back then, when you and I were fighting the debt in the late 70s, it was less than 1 trillion. In fact, when I became budget director, it was 930 billion. I remember it well. And the first thing we had to do was swallow a very bitter pill and ask the Congress for a debt ceiling increase because of all the spending and the disaster we inherited. So, you know, that's not that long ago. That's less than 40 years ago. It was less than 1 trillion then. It's 22 trillion now. It's going to 40 trillion. It's built in, unless there is a sweeping revolution, really, in Congress and in the next election. It's built in terms of these massive entitlements. I call it the welfare state, the massive warfare state that, frankly, Trump has only made worse with another 100 billion of spending. And so that's why I was motivated to write this book, Peak Trump, because I actually voted for Trump as clearly a better alternative than, 4 more years of the status quo under the Clinton, Bush, et cetera, bipartisan regime. And I was especially impressed that he had an open mind about foreign policy, and that maybe it was time to stop being policemen for the world, that we couldn't afford the American empire. And he articulated in a kind of crude but still sensible way an America First foreign policy. Now, unfortunately, after 2 years in office, the title of my book, I think, explains where I stand. I call it Peak Trump, the Undrainable Swamp, and the Fantasy of MAGA, M-A-G-A, Make America Great Again. And the reason I say that is that in the campaign, he had it right. He called the so-called recovery since the crisis a decade ago one big, fat, ugly bubble. That was when the stock market, the S&P 500, was at 2140. 2 years later, September 20th, this last fall, It was at 29.40, up 800 points. Nothing had been done to rectify the mess that we're getting into, and all of a sudden he embraced it wholeheartedly and called it, evidence of vindication of the Trump boom. Terrible mistake. Secondly, he brags all the time about how good the economy is. It's not good. On Main Street, after 10 years, real household income is still where it was in 2007. Industrial production is only up 3%. By contrast, the NASDAQ 100, which is really the technology index in the stock market, was up 200% after adjusting for inflation at the peak, what I call peak Trump last fall. So, how do you have 200% gain in Wall Street and essentially zero gain on Main Street? That's not a recovery. That's a disaster waiting to happen. Finally, he was on the right track earlier last year when we had the Singapore summit, and we had some hope that finally, 65 years after a war that never should have happened on the Korean Peninsula, maybe finally there could be some resolution of that unnecessary conflict. And then even more so in the Helsinki summit, when there was a lot of light and hope that maybe this unnecessary confrontation with Russia could be abated. But what's happened, unfortunately, he's so surrounded by neocon advisors and failed generals and all the rest, and he's been retreating left and right ever since. So that's why I say peak Trump, Ron. Peak when he embraced a stock market that's going to collapse. Peak when he embraced an economy that's in terrible shape, and the next recession is right around the corner. Peak Trump, because on foreign policy, the one hope we had is going suddenly retreating in the wrong direction.
David, I want to ask you a question about timing. I go through some of this, not as well as you do, but then I get the question, but how long is it going to last? It's lasted longer than you thought. And you talk about sudden rapid changes, and you talk about peaking out, and I think you've emphasized better than anybody else the emphasis on debt. This can't be sustained. But when anybody tries to pin you down or give an estimate, even if not pinning you down, what do you think? Is this going to last another month? Is it going to last another year? Are they going to be able to do this? We were concerned when it was $1 trillion, now it's $22 trillion. So timing is pretty darn important, but I do think that we must be getting pretty close to that peak amount of debt that we can sustain.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's timing plus, and here's the key issue. What is the Federal Reserve doing as the Treasury is out there now borrowing $1.2 trillion plus or minus during the current year? The answer is we're at a pivot point. 30 years of the Fed buying the debt, quantitative easing and just expanding its balance sheet has come to an end, and that is crucial because the Fed really was putting its big fat thumb on the scale of supply and demand in the bond pits, and through its massive purchases was actually creating artificial demand for government debt, thereby causing the price to be higher, the yield to be lower than would be true in an honest free market, and thereby giving false signals to politicians that you could just keep building this debt and it doesn't matter. Now, I want to give one statistic that I think is so crucial in understanding this. If we go back to 1987, right before the so-called, Black Monday scare we had back then, Greenspan took over. The balance sheet of the Fed was $200 billion. That's how much, money they had printed out of thin air. It had taken them almost 80 years to get there from when it opened. And at the peak, as you know, a year or so ago, it was at 4.5 trillion. So what I'm saying is, from the Reagan era through the present, the Fed printed 4.3 trillion of additional balance sheet. That basically scooped up, sopped up, sequestered that much government debt or quasi-government debt, the GSE debt, which is a substitute. And that fundamentally distorted the bond market in the direction of high prices, low yields, and encouragement for everybody to borrow like there's no tomorrow. But now, here's the key thing: is the Fed, for the first time in history, is shrinking its balance sheet, because even the Keynesians who run the joint realized they went way too far. They're now shrinking by $600 billion a year. That's called quantitative tightening. And it's the same thing, although they try to disguise it as technical. It's not. It's the same thing as dumping $600 billion a year of bonds into the market rather than buying them. And when you sell bonds, when you dump them into the bond pits, you cause the price to go down and the yield to go up. Now, if you put together the fact that the Treasury, Uncle Sam, will be borrowing $1.2 trillion in the current year, and the Fed will be selling $600 billion. Last time I did the math, that adds up to $1.8 trillion, 9% of GDP. The two arms of our government will be dumping into the bond pits, the Treasury and the Fed, and that's going to have a shocking effect on yields and interest rates, and it's going to send the economy into a tailspin sooner or later. I don't know if it's next month or next quarter or next year, but I think we're near the end of the road.
Yeah, I take your answer to mean it's next week. But Daniel has a question for you.
David, I just, first of all, I want to thank you for joining us, and it's a special treat when a board member of the Ron Paul Institute joins us, so thanks so much for being that too. I'm going to key in a little bit on the subtitle of your book, which is The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA, as you pointed out earlier. From the subtitle, it almost sounds like you've kind of given up your optimism. You've thrown your hands up. This is over. This can't be fixed. However, later in the book, you do have a chapter called How to Drain the Swamp, Homeland Defense, Not Empire. Tell us, have you given up? Have you thrown your hands up, or is there a way out of this?
No, I haven't given up, although I've given up on Trump because, unfortunately, he has got such a giant ego that he doesn't really understand that a lot of what's going on is not a reflection of the good deeds he's accomplished, but simply the last gasp of a failed system that's going to take him down. But in any event, the great mistake he made, how can you shrink the empire? How can you kind of, retreat to America first from policing the world if you're going to add $100 billion a year to a national security budget that was already, equal to the next 8 or 9 countries combined? That was a terrible mistake. And my point here, Dan, is that the real swamp in Washington is on the Pentagon side of the Potomac River. That's where the real swamp is, the military-industrial surveillance, congressional pork barrel complex, if you want to put it all together. And he has just fed the monster. If you look around Washington, the great prosperity, the building, and all these new hotels and restaurants and office buildings, et cetera, apartment buildings, all of that wealth is coming from the fact that we spend $800 billion a year on the whole intelligence complex and defense contracting, the Pentagon, and the hundreds of thousands of people who work for it, all in the name of empire. And until we decide that we aren't an empire, that we're a republic again, that we can't afford to be an empire, that we failed as an empire, that non-intervention has to be the touchstone of policy. Until we do that, you're never going to bring the military-industrial surveillance, $800 billion swamp under control. So that's my perspective on it. And at some point, we're going to have a fiscal crisis soon, because for the reasons we've just discussed. And then maybe, in the context of a real fiscal crisis where interest rates are going up and everybody's panicking and they don't want to cut all their favorite pork barrel projects at home, maybe we'll get a second look at this massive swamp, as I say, on the Pentagon side of the river. If we do, I think maybe there's some hope. If we roll back the warfare state, maybe you have a chance of at least curtailing the welfare state. If you do both of those, then you've got a chance somewhere down the road of having relative national solvency. But we're nowhere near close now. We're going in the wrong direction at a very rapid, accelerating speed. I'm talking, here fiscally, because despite, given all this spending, the huge increase in the defense budget, a tax cut that may or may not have been a good idea, but it needed to be financed.
Right.
And they just got out the credit card and wrote a 1.7 trillion additional debt. I'm saying with all of that happening, and then going into the 2020s, when the entire baby boom generation of 80 million strong is going to be retiring and putting huge pressure on Social Security, Medicare,
Right.
all the rest.
David, I want to ask you something a little philosophically about our foreign policy. This weekend, Tulsi Gabbard announced she's running for president. She's a progressive type Democrat from Hawaii, and she's announced that she's running. But she has a foreign policy that I think that you and I could be very, very supportive of, because it sounds a lot about what we talk about. She's a non-interventionist, and she's not bashful about it. But on her announcement, boy, did she get hit. She got hit by the media. She got hit by Republicans and Democrats. And evidently the cards are stacked against us, as if we didn't know. But just make a comment about that, on how vicious the attacks were. And it sort of shows you that this is not a partisan issue. The deep state is nonpartisan, and they're in control, and boy, did they go after her. And that's why I think we struggle, and thank goodness people like you are on our board, and we try to change that attitude about foreign policy, because obviously that contributes, like you point out, tremendously to our deficit.
Yes, it is really staggering what happened this last weekend, particularly when NBC just ran a smear job based on some experts, so-called, who really are just, contractors for the federal government. They live off the deep state, and they were the same folks who were involved in trying to plant the false flag Russian interference in the Alabama Senate race a few months back earlier last year. So when I saw the viciousness and intensity of this attack, it was just a reminder once again that the mainstream media, and I call CNN the war channel, and that's what it is, and MSNBC is actually worse, and then you can throw in the New York Times and the Wall Street, or even the Wall Street Journal on foreign policy, and the Washington Post. That's your mainstream media. They're entirely handmaids of the warfare state. It's based on what we could call access journalism. They want to get leaks from the Pentagon or the State Department or the National Security Council, or even the various 17 agencies of the intelligence complex. You have to basically butter them up and spin the stories and news in a manner that they approve. This is what's happened to the mainstream media. So it's really too bad, but I look forward to her candidacy, and having those 24 Democrats on the podium there in their version of the primary debates, and hearing at least one very articulate, fluent advocate of non-intervention. She's been great on everything. I really admire her foreign policy position. And also, she served 2 terms in Iraq. So she, you can't say she's some kind of pinko, pacifist who doesn't understand the world. I don't know where she gets her views from and her good advice, but she is very impressive.
Right, right.
Hope she can raise enough money to stay in the primary and at least have a fair debate and expose some of the handmaids of the warfare state who are running in the Democratic primary or will be.
Yeah, that'll give us some enjoyment. It'll remind us of something that happened about 10 years ago, too. But, as long as we're sort of on current events, to do a quickie, because I guess we're getting somewhat close to time closing. But dominating the headlines, dominating our thoughts, dominating what we're doing right now, is this whole business with Venezuela. Everything is on the table. We've got to reinstall democracy in Venezuela. What's your take on this, David?
Well, it's just another case of the neocon, interventionist, world policeman notion of foreign policy rising to the surface, and Trump falling for the debate, as he has several times. And then, if you can imagine this, one of the worst neocon war mongers that has plied his trade in Washington for the last, 4 decades, talking about Elliott Abrams, who goes all the way back to our intervention in Central America during the 1980s and the Iran-Contra affair and all the rest of it. And then he was a chief advocate and proponent of the Iraq war when he was in the second Bush administration. How in the world can a guy who ran on America First and that, we're going broke trying to run the world, appoint this guy to be his point man for Venezuela? It just tells you the swamp is so deep. Wow. And you can look at the cover of my book. I think you had it on before. I got the creatures crawling all over the White House, and this is a case in point. And it's something I posted a while ago on my site, David Stockman's Contra Corner. I said, Trump has pulled a Truman, whether he realizes it or not. He essentially nationalized Citgo, which is based down there in your end of the world, Ron, in Houston. It's an American petroleum company that happens to be owned by Venezuela. He nationalized it and basically said, all the revenue that you generate and the profits that would normally be upstreamed to the Venezuelan government will now be sent to the alternative government that we've decreed to be the official government of Venezuela. Now, if that isn't a return to the kind of gunboat diplomacy that we practiced even before World War I don't know what is. This is really disappointing, and I think it's a reminder to all of us just how tenacious and how dug in and how all-pervasive the deep state ideology is in Washington. It's just groupthink. They go down there and they think they're part of some crew running the world. It's right. Very disappointing.
Okay.
That's crazy. Well, the book, thank you, David. The book is called Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA. Get it on Amazon.com. It's coming out in a few days. You can pre-order it now. Dr. Paul?
And David, I certainly want to thank you for being with us today. It's been great. And if people want to follow up on this, you have a lot of literature out there. And they also can go to Contra Corner, your website, in order to follow up on it. And that would be good. But David, thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, great to be with you.
All right. And I want to thank our viewers today for tuning in, and please come back soon to the Liberty Report.